Ganja White Night has become a premier act in the bass music scene in recent years, but it took them quite a long time to get there, and they even came close to giving up at one point. Their rise to the top was far from explosive. Rather, they took the long but rewarding road of staying consistent to their unique sound without trying to ride trends or generate hype. They've been able to steadily pick up new fans over time, gaining momentum with each passing year, and after doing this for the last 22 years, they've found themselves sitting among the top artists in bass music. In this video, we'll be reliving the long journey of Ganja White Night, unveiling the lesser known parts of their career path, and how all of those things brought them to where they are today.
Start this fucking live right now by saying one thing. Keep pursuing your dream all your fucking life, because one day this will happen.
Ganja White Night as we know them today is a duo consisting of Benjamin Bayul, whose nickname is Bambi, and Charlie Dodson, whose nickname is R1, also known as Erwin. They both grew up in the small city of Mons, Belgium, which is about an hour drive from Brussels, Belgium's capital city. Growing up, Bambi took great influence from a wide variety of music, including lots of metal, Michael Jackson, as well as Pendulum's album Hold Your Color. As for Erwin, he enjoyed Bob Marley, Cypress Hill, the Beastie Boys, as well as a lot of Aphex Twin. Obviously, there's also a strong visual element to the Ganja White Night brand, which can probably be attributed to their love for movies. Bambi is a huge fan of pretty much every movie that was directed by Christopher Nolan, as well as Back to the Future, and Erwin's favorite movies are Children of Men and Snatch. The duo met each other for the first time at a rave in Brussels in 2002 when they were both 17 years old. They began attending more raves together, as well as plenty of drum and bass parties, and they were able to meet a few other producers at these parties, and one of those producers that they've known since the beginning is Apache, who has been around for a very long time, but has been blowing up more in recent years. In an interview with UKF, Bambi recalls these times by saying, Erwin was one of the cool kids who had an electronic machine that he was always carrying around in a small suitcase. He would bring it to anyone's house, plug it in, put on the headphones, and stay on that machine for hours. We were listening to weird music at that time. When the Scream album hit, we fell in love with dubstep right at the beginning. We were spoiled with dubstep, and ever since then, we never really jumped off that 140 BPM train. When they first met, Erwin had already been messing around with Fruity Loops, so Bambi jumped right in and they began to learn together. They created the name Ganja White Night right at the very beginning, after staying up all night, smoking some ganja, and making some music. Speaking about this in one of their Reddit AMAs, they said, "We chose the name Ganja White Night because in French, having a white night means staying up all night, so you get the idea." At the formation of the group, Ganja White Night actually had 3 members. The third member is named Francois Vollerau, who had his own project called La Belge Electrode, but he ultimately left Ganja White Night in 2012, which we'll dig into more later in the video. Since Ganja White Night didn't get much media attention until long after La Belge Electrode left the group, there isn't too much information on his involvement in the early days. Anyways, going back to Bambi and Erwin, after they were messing around with Fruity Loops for a bit, they decided to move to Cubase, which they still use today. In the early 2000s, resources for learning how to produce were scarce, so they had to do a lot of experimenting and figuring things out on their own.
You know, we were having fun and just were not taking that super seriously. I mean, we're trying our best to make good stuff, you know, but it's...
What were you trying to make at the time?
I don't even think we had, like, I could classify that into a style.
Yeah.
it was just experimentation, let's say, and we were just having fun. I remember we were sampling, like, kickflip sounds from Tony Hawk Pro Skater.
Oh, yeah.
And making, like, beats with that. And
that's great.
It was fun, you know, we're having fun and we're really high. And still, you gotta realize that too.
In high school, they both took a musique concrète class where they learned how to manipulate sounds and had to create pieces that were interesting to listen to without using any melody or percussion, and this has probably helped them to a degree. As far as I'm aware, they didn't release any music for the first 6 years from 2002 to 2008. They just had a group name and made music together. I can't confirm that for sure, but there's no evidence of any releases that occurred in those years, so if anyone has any info regarding releases around that time, let me know in the comments. In 2008, Rusko put out a production masterclass video, and Ganja and their producer friends were all over it trying to learn how to make those classic Rusko wobbles.
Rusko, we're going to learn a few little tricks and prep a few jokes in the studio today. When we play that with the tune and the effects. Kind of like that. It's got that kind of shuffle groove following on with it there.
And I remember we spent, like, masterclass video back then were rare.
Right.
And everybody know that masterclass of Rusko showing how he makes wobbles with albino, like that VST
that
with the red
classic
thing.
old video, yeah.
I remember we were watching this posing, trying to zoom to see what the setting was, to say, how does he make that sound? I know many of us did that.
In 2008, they released their first album, which was originally intended to be called Peace by Fear, but they decided to change it to be a self-titled album called Ganja White Night. For clarification, I want to note that DSPs have the release year of this album listed as 2010, but Bambi has said that it was released in 2008, so we'll go with that. It's very possible that the album just didn't hit DSPs until 2010, which would make sense as Spotify was just getting started back then, and digital distribution services weren't as widely available as they are today. To release the album, they launched their own record label called Subcarbon Records in order to self-release, which has been their strategy since the beginning because record labels didn't want to sign any of their music until it was too late and Ganja didn't need record labels anymore. To be clear, they have released on some of their collaborators' labels in more recent years, as well as a handful of single releases on niche labels early on, but the vast majority of their music is self-released. Upon the release of their debut album, it hit #1 on Juno Download, which they thought was exciting, but they didn't fully comprehend what exactly that really meant. Back then, you couldn't see stats on what countries or cities people were listening from, but their early music was actually being well received in the United States, they just didn't realize it until much later. As for the cover art for the album, they enlisted Ebo, who's a renowned Belgian street artist, and they basically paid him all of the money they had.
He drew the first cover artwork for our first album back in 2008. And it was pretty pricey for us. I remember we kind of spent all we had on the side just to have that done.
Ebo has played a massive role in the visual aspect of Ganja White Night, but they didn't enlist him for any more work until 7 years later because they just couldn't afford it, and we'll dive into Ebo more later into the video. One of the tracks on that first album that stood out to me is called Gay Fish, and I wonder if they drew inspiration for that song from the South Park episode known as Fish Sticks, where Kanye West is convinced that he's a gay fish.
Cause I know that I'm a gay fish, yo. Motherfucking gay fish, I'm a fish, yo.
Obviously, the name seems to draw a connection, plus both the song in the South Park episode as well as Ganja White Night's song both use goofy, overprocessed auto-tune, so I think that was their way of paying homage to the South Park episode. However, the South Park episode was released in 2009, so if this song actually was inspired by South Park, then maybe the album actually was released in 2010, not 2008. The connection to South Park is just a personal theory though, and since Bambi said in a podcast that the album was released in 2008, that's what we'll stick with. After the release of their debut album, they began getting booked for gigs around Europe, such as Belgium's premier drum and bass party called Criticals. There's even some footage of these early gigs, such as this clip from a set that they played in Holland in 2009. Even though they were landing gigs, they never intended to make a career out of it, and they didn't even know that that was possible. They said that back then, even DJs who were playing every weekend weren't making that much money, so everything that they were doing was simply for the love of the music. In an interview with UKF, they looked back on their mindset in these times by saying, "If you would have told us that we will be living on our music, we would not believe you." So you can imagine how crazy this is to us. We're from Belgium. It seems so unreachable for us to be where we are right now, knowing where we're from. It's a fucking dream. Even though they weren't necessarily aiming to create a career in music, they still hustled because they loved it so much. In those early years, they would plan their own tours, frequently posting their Gmail address on their socials asking for bookings, and sometimes asking if anyone would let them crash at their place while on tour. Sometimes they would even add new last-minute bookings while in the midst of a tour whenever they were able to fit it into their schedule. They took this DIY approach for many years, and clearly it has paid off for them. Speaking of DIY, that brings us to today's video sponsor, Basshead Beads. I personally have been raving for 9 years now, and as a seasoned vet, I know how important candy can be to fellow ravers, and Basshead Beads is here to take your candy game to the next level. Basshead Beads have been popping up around festivals more and more in recent years, so I was super excited when Basshead Beads reached out to me to sponsor this video. As a company entirely owned and run by ravers, they understand that candy isn't just about the beads, it's about the memories and connections that they create. They know how special candy trading can be and the difference the perfect candy can make. That's why they offer a diverse range of over 300 unique bead designs that cater to every passion. Here's a quick look at what you can find on their website. Let's click Shop by Festival, and let's go with Lost Lands. Here we can look through a wide selection of designs that come in different sizes, including mini, jumbo, and regular. I'm gonna go with Kevin the Alien because who doesn't love Kevin? Let's do the glow-in-the-dark option in a 30-pack. If you enter the code AudioEats in the discount code box, you'll get 15% off your order, and you'll be supporting the channel as well. I've included a link in the description so you can check out all the designs that I won't have time to show you, but I just want to take a second to show you how creative some of these original designs are. Some of my personal favorites are the Sprout clips, record player, and the cool little Walkman players. Basshead Beads kindly sent me a package with hundreds of beads in varying sizes, so I started crafting some candy of my own as soon as it came in. I was pretty impressed with how detailed the beads are, especially the mini ones since they're so small. They're definitely higher quality than anything else I've seen, and I really mean that. They're all 3D printed in-house, and every bead has a nice glossy finish. Here, I'll show you some of the bracelets that I made using Basshead beads. There's this rubber duck one with cute little ducks using all 3 sizes, a nice little breakfast bracelet with avocado toast and coffee, a dinosaur bracelet which is perfect for Lost Lands, a glow-in-the-dark bracelet which was actually impressively bright when I tested it out, and my personal favorite, a bracelet with speakers that look like a mini version of Mackie Thump monitors, complete with green and glow-in-the-dark aliens, and the Basshead Beads logo as a nice finishing touch. Basshead Beads are the perfect addition to your next show or festival, and they're sure to bring a smile to the faces of your fellow ravers. Check out my link in the description, or use code AudioEats at checkout to get 15% off your next order of these high-quality beads. In 2010, Ganja White Night made a return to Criticals for their 2nd year in a row, as well as a self-orchestrated UK tour. By this point in their career, they were making a name for themselves locally in Europe, but they still had a long road ahead to grow their reach into other continents. Though I don't think growing into an international act was necessarily even something they were focused on at this point, as they just enjoyed what they were doing and were having fun with it. The next year in 2011, they appeared on a Belgian dubstep EP called Astrophonic Dubstep 3, made in Belgium, which obviously featured budding dubstep artists from Belgium. That same year, they completed and released their 2nd album called In the Garden. One of the tracks on the album, called Hindu Kush, was played out by them exclusively on their UK tour the year prior, which gave their UK fans a sense of exclusivity, a great strategy for building a loyal fan base. Looking back at their tour photos from 2010 and 2011, it's clear that they were starting to draw considerable crowds, and Bambi and Irwin started to realize the potential that their project had. By the beginning of 2012, the two of them were ready to push the project as hard as they could, which was going to require more commitment from all 3 members. They asked their 3rd member, Francois, if he was ready to make that commitment, and he decided that it would be best if he stepped down. He already had his own side project as LaBelge Electrode, so stepping up to the next level would likely leave him with little time for that project. The split was completely amicable, as Ganja White Night continued to support their friend by sharing his music on their social accounts even after the split. So with LaBelge Electrode no longer being involved in the production of their music, their sound naturally changed. This was immediately noticeable with their first release after the split, the 2-track Jock Horror EP, which features those classic Ganja White Night wobbles that we know them for today. The Bubblegum EP came just 1 month later, and for the rest of their first year as a duo, they played some big events in Europe like Blackout in Brussels and Blizzard XL in Holland. They also began to share more content on social media, such as videos of them jamming on a small table, which they filmed on their cell phones. The setup seen in this video is the same way that they would play live, as they never had any interest in DJing or playing other people's music, which just shows their dedication to the long and hard path that was also going to be the most rewarding. They didn't even learn how to DJ until much later, when they found themselves in situations where it was too expensive and logistically challenging to carry around all of their hardware. In 2013, they released their third album, which was the first without LaBelge Electrode, called Mystic Herbalist. The first track on the album is called Endless Sky, which has a sample at the beginning that pays homage to the departure of LaBelge Electrode. The sample says that it is the end of the beginning, which was their way of stating that Ganja White Night was entering a new era.
It is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Endless Sky actually plays a huge part in the way that their brand would develop in the future, as it was the catalyst for the creation of their Mr. Wobble mascot. Bambi told the story in one of their Reddit AMAs where he said, "Back in 2012, I think I had insomnia frequently, and one night I woke up and started listening to Endless Sky in loop and decided to write a music video for it. So in my head, I created that big tall character called Mr. Wobble that was walking in the street, and everything he was touching would start wobbling and oscillating. Obviously, creating a fully animated music video back then was impossible because it would have cost too much money. A few years after, when we started working with Ebo, and because of the success of the Mr. Wobble album, we decided to bring this idea back to life, so I explained to Ebo the concept that I had back then. We injected almost everything we had saved into creating this first animated music video, and it was one of the best decisions we've ever made. Obviously, Mr. Wobble is now a massive part of their project, which we'll talk about more later, but it's fascinating how the idea came about so many years prior to the creation of Mr. Wobble as we know him today. As for the rest of 2013, they released a 2-track EP called Green Poison. One of the tracks is called Monstars, which is likely a reference to the Monstars from Space Jam, and the other track is obviously called Green Poison. They also went on their first US mini tour that year, with shows planned in Tyler, Texas and Minneapolis. However, they got screwed over by the promoter for the Tyler show, so they put him on blast on Facebook, but fortunately they were able to add an extra show last minute in Lincoln, Nebraska, and everything went well for that show as well as the one in Minneapolis. Minnesota has played a big role in their come up in the United States, and they now consider it to be a home away from home, so it's pretty cool that one of their first ever US shows occurred there. That small tour helped them break into the US market, as they were able to go on another US tour later on in the year, this time with more shows as well as festival appearances. They played at Still Dream Festival in Belden, California, Indian Summer Festival in Waubun, Minnesota, as well as their first appearance at Infrasound, back when it still took place in Wisconsin. Aside from those festivals, they also returned to Lincoln and Minneapolis once again, as well as stops in Iowa City and Denver. That show in Denver was their first time in the city, and they took that opportunity to go to Red Rocks to check out the legendary venue. Immediately upon seeing it, they dreamed of playing there one day, but little did they know that in 8 years, they would be selling out the venue for 3 nights in a row. Now, as I previously mentioned, they released their Mystic Herbalist album in 2013, but they actually released a lesser-known second album that year. It's called X Echo, and it features 9 tracks that are all collaborations with a rapper who goes by the name Simon, who was actually featured on the track Buddha from their 2011 album In the Garden. They released X Echo under the name Ganja White Night and Simon, and they actually got some traction with it in Europe and got some bookings. The album wasn't popular in the US, likely because the lyrics are all in French, and a lot of American fans of Ganja White Night didn't even know about it. However, due to their success in Europe, they decided to form an official group with Simon, and they called themselves Vice Vertu.
Chacun reste à sa place, sinon ça peut vite monter d'un ton. On refait notre habit de mineur pour explorer tes bas-fonds. La majeure partie du temps on travaille sur l'émotion. Notre arrivée dans ta bulle t'offre des bonnes sensations. Nos ondes sensuelles guident tes émois vers la paix.
They released their second album in 2015 called Action Redaction, which continued to get them gigs in Europe. However, they played their final gigs as Vice Vertu in 2016, likely due to the growing success of Ganja White Night, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now let's rewind to 2014. They launched a remix contest for their track called Bubblegum, with the winning remixes being released on Subcarbon Records as a part of the Bubblegum Remix EP. The winners were Chakra, Kong Speaks, Abstracker, Klaxon, and Mukratis, and the EP was released at the end of the year. This was actually the first time that Subcarbon ever released any other artist's music. Ganja White Night also had new music of their own ready to release in 2014, and in February, they put out the Crystal EP, followed by the Primal Instinct EP, then the Freddy Skunk EP. By the time summer rolled around, they released their 4th album called Addiction. That same summer, they were in the US for another tour, including stops in Iowa City, Minneapolis, Chicago, Denver, New York City, Salt Lake City, as well as their second year at Infrasound. During that tour, they sold what appears to be the first ever Ganja White Night merch, which features the artwork from their Addiction album. They also had a bit of free time on that tour, and they decided to go to their first ever EDC Las Vegas as fans, not knowing that they would be playing at the festival 5 years later. They also continued to grow their European fan base that year, playing shows in France and Germany, as well as their home country of Belgium. On top of everything that they were doing with the project, they also launched Subcarbon Studios, where they offered freelance production services as well as mixing and mastering because they were trying to bring in more money to support themselves and the project. By 2015, their reach was continuing to grow, and it was shaping up to be their biggest year yet. They went on a 15-date US tour, which was their biggest US tour that they had ever done, and they also played shows in Paris, as well as their hometown of Mons, Belgium. As I mentioned earlier, they also released their Vice Vertu album that year, and they also produced a track for an artist named Heart Streets, with the song being called Under My Skin.
I don't care if you don't like me, 'cause
on top of all of that, they also released the 2-track Strata EP. With their growing success, they finally had enough money to enlist Ebo once again, 7 years after he did the album art for their debut album. Ebo made art to help promote their singles off of the upcoming album, as well as the cover art for the actual album, and he also designed them a new logo, the one that you all know that they still use today. In September of that year, the album was released, which was their 5th album, called Hybrid Distillery. After the release of the album, they were at an all-time high career-wise, but their doubts were also at an all-time high. As successful as they may have appeared from the outside looking in, they still weren't able to live off of the Ganja White Night project because they reinvested every dollar they made back into the project, so they weren't profiting at all.
We put so much effort into that project for so many years. It's slow. We see things moving. It's moving the right way, but it's so slow. We don't know if we're going to be able to, maintain that energy to into the project and being able to build our life too. I just had met my wife 2 years before that, so 2013, and we had plans. We wanted to make a family. And I was bringing no money home at all. again, like back then, we were not getting any money from the project. Everything we ever made was reinjected into the project to Ganja White Night to make it grow. And it was so slow. And early 2016, started showing people, teasing some teaser video of the Mr. Wobble album, me working on the music. And it started to really go faster.
Yeah.
And like I told you, my wife just got pregnant and the project kind of exploded in the same time. I was like, gosh, I'm so glad we didn't give up.
Right.
Because we were close to like starting investing time into other things and just to make a living.
Just like Bambi said in that clip, they continued to work on new music while still wrestling with doubt. In February of 2016, they began posting video clips of them playing their new music in the studio, which is something they had done for a long time, but this time around, the videos really started gaining traction. The attention that these clips were receiving gave them a glimmer of hope in a time when they were unsure how much longer they could actually carry on with the project. However, on June 1st, 2016, they released their 6th album called Mr. Wobble, and that album was about to change their life. It was the debut of the Mr. Wobble character, which gave their brand a strong and recognizable image, which is a key branding staple of many high-level artists. The album originally had different cover art as seen here, but they decided the album deserved better, so they enlisted the help of Ebo. I have no idea if this was actually going to be the album cover or if it was just a joke, but either way, I think they made the right decision going with Ebo. The album was an instant hit with fans, and immediately upon its release, they embarked on the Mr. Wobble tour, kicking things off at Infrasound, which was very fitting given how much that festival supported them in the early years. They then played shows all across the US for the next 3 weeks, finishing off the first leg of the Mr. Wobble tour. After having just played to some of their biggest crowds ever, they added fuel to the fire when they dropped the Wobble Master music video, which was the first time that fans got to see Mr. Wobble in action. Mr. Wobble has been the focal point of their music videos ever since, with each video unveiling a new piece of the Mr. Wobble saga. These videos aren't just fun visuals, they're actually telling a story, and fans follow along just like they would with their favorite TV show. In the Wobble Master video, fans are introduced to Mr. Wobble as he grooves his way through the forest, emitting some sort of powerful force. He makes his way to a dystopian city where he appears to break people out of their unconscious daze, where they're pacified by phones and pills. At the end of the video, Mr. Wobble comes face to face with animated versions of Ganja White Night, and the scene closes out with them jumping towards Mr. Wobble. Paying someone to make an animated music video is wildly expensive, and with a renowned artist like Ebo, I'm sure they paid quite a large sum to have that video made, so it's impressive they were willing to take that risk at a time when they were considering giving up on the project.
We felt it would be really too pricey and not possible.
Yeah.
But after the success of Mr. Wobble, the album right after Hybrid Distillery, we're like, okay, Ebo, let's make it happen. We got this money, it's almost everything we have. Let's make a music video. Let's do it. And then he made Mr. Wobble. It's from a concept, actually, from an idea I had back in 2012, I think. Like I was writing a story of a character called Mr. Wobble that had superpowers while walking in the street, and everything he would touch would start wobbling and that kind of stuff. And I presented that to Ebo. I say, you know that movie, The Iron Giant?
Oh, yeah.
So I like those proportions, like one massive character with a small head. And then he came out with the proportion of Mr. Wobble being like a fat orange guy wearing a orange tracksuit and having a mysterious head. So, and he's really simple like that because it would be easier to animate.
Taking that risk was exactly what they needed, as they had created the perfect storm by adding a new layer of depth to the project that fans could sink their teeth into. Things were starting to look up for them at the perfect time, as Bambi's wife was newly pregnant and he needed to be able to support his family. They kicked off the second leg of the Mr. Wobble tour in August of 2016, and their momentum was quickly picking up. While in Minnesota for the tour, they played an extra set on a boat on Lake Minnetonka as their way of giving back to a place that had been so influential in their career growth. They were starting to get more festival bookings as well, such as Mysteryland, Sewanee Halloween, Up North, and their Electric Forest debut, which marked a major turning point in their career. They got some more exposure towards the end of 2016 when Forbes put out an article about the future of record labels, and Subcarbon got a mention, which was a big win for them and an indicator of their growing reach. At the beginning of October, just months after the release of the Wobblemaster music video, Ganja White Night released Wobblemaster VIP, which started to pick up steam over the following months. A few weeks later on Halloween, they released their second video from the Mr. Wobble saga, the music video for LFO Requiem. The video introduces us to a new character named Dark Wobble, who is Mr. Wobble's arch nemesis. The leaders of the dystopian society convince civilians that Mr. Wobble is a threat in order to justify their destructive pursuit of him. While the military is chasing Mr. Wobble, Dark Wobble appears and battles it out with our thick boy orange hero, while a terrified child observes the battle. The military drops a bomb intended for Mr. Wobble, but it's headed straight for the child, so Mr. Wobble darts towards the child to protect them, with Dark Wobble hanging on his back. Dark Wobble gets hit with the bomb and lies lifeless on the ground while the child embraces Mr. Wobble with gratitude. However, at the very final moments of the video, Dark Wobble's mysterious green force returns to him. The same day that this video was released, Ganja White Night played their first ever Halloween show in Minneapolis, which was basically the first ever Wobbleween, but it was called Subcarbon Records Halloween Party. That show marked the end of their third leg of the Mr. Wobble tour, and a week later, they announced a massive 24-date tour that would kick off in late February the following year. 2016 was such a pivotal year for the project, as everything fell into place perfectly in order to keep the project alive and give Bambi and Irwin hope for the future. They had gained more momentum than ever before, which set them up for an explosive breakout year in 2017. By the beginning of 2017, they were able to add 7 more shows to their previously announced spring tour, bringing it to a total of 31 shows, with many of them selling out far in advance. One of those 31 shows was the debut of their first ever Ganja White Night Budz event, which has become one of their mini flagship events. They brought Boogie T along as support, and they were able to make a collab on tour, which became one of their biggest tracks ever, called Flava. It was released later that summer, and it became an instant hit with the perfect mix of melody, Rastafarian vibes, and of course, the wubs. When festival season rolled around, they were all over lineups, playing Buku, Shambhala, Electric Forest, the first ever Lost Lands, Bonnaroo, Okeechobee, and of course, Infrasound, as well as many others. 2017 was the year that the life that they had been working towards for so long finally became a full-blown reality, which was perfect timing because Bambi's son was also born that year. Moving on into 2018, they kicked off the year by releasing their Origins album at the beginning of February and set out on the Origins tour just a few months later. Their tour bus was absolutely decked out, featuring artwork from none other than Ebo, who got to come along for the ride. After the tour, they had an absolutely stacked festival season, playing at the Gorge for the first time for Paradiso, as well as their first time playing Red Rocks for Global Dub Festival, plus countless other festivals like a return to Lost Lands and Buku. That summer, they played another boat show on Lake Minnetonka a week before they played at the Loft in Minneapolis, which was where they played one of their first ever US shows 5 years prior. 2 months later in August, they released the third music video in the Mr. Wobble saga, this time the most in-depth one yet, called Shock Shell, which took Ebo 6 months to make. The video takes a trip back in time to explore the ancient energies that power Mr. Wobble and Dark Wobble, and how those energies have been fighting for control for a very long time. By the way, these are very brief descriptions that I'm giving of the videos, so I highly recommend watching them all in order if you really want to dive more into the Mr. Wobble saga. In October, they released a VIP remix of their track called Mango, which was from their 2014 Addiction album. Nearing the end of the year, they began teasing their Jungle Juice collab with Liquid Stranger at their shows, but the track wasn't released until the following year. At the end of the year, they auctioned off one of their famous orange Wobble Adidas track jackets in an effort to raise money for Operation Warm, which provides children with winter jackets. This was one of only 2 of their iconic track jackets that they have ever given away, so they're extremely rare and basically unattainable, and I'll talk about the second one that was given away in just a bit. At the beginning of 2019, they announced that they would be taking a few months off to get some work done, as they had big plans for the rest of the year. Their first release of the year came in March, a collab with Subtronics called Headband, which was originally made on their Origins tour the previous year, as Subtronics was a supporting artist on that tour.
What's up? Busy working on shit. We should release the whole. Yes.
They released a music video for it, which features Mr. Wobble, but it's not technically a part of the greater Mr. Wobble saga. However, Subtronics does become part of the Wobbleverse later on. Starting at the end of March, their short hiatus was over, and they hit festival season hard, playing EDC Las Vegas for the first time, 5 years after they went to the festival as fans. They also played Electric Forest and Moonrise once again, plus Sunset Music Festival, Ubby Dubby, Audiotistic, Camp Bisco, as well as many others, including getting to close out the main stage at Lost Lands. In the midst of all of that, they somehow found the time to move to the US from Belgium because their schedule was just too hectic and it made way more sense to have their home base in the US. They spent a little bit of time living in Minneapolis before ultimately moving to Los Angeles, where they still live today. In May of that year, they got Ebo to paint a Ganja White Night mural in Denver, which is probably one of the most unique marketing strategies that I've ever seen in electronic music. A second mural went up in Minneapolis in August, just before their second ever Ganja White Night Budz show. A month later in September, they released their long-awaited collab with Liquid Stranger called Jungle Juice, which became wildly popular and sits atop their discography as their most popular track to date. The track got a music video, but just like the first Subtronics video, it doesn't really play into the greater story of Mr. Wobble. Moving forward, they were gearing up for their upcoming album release by doing another Orange Wobble track jacket giveaway, which was the last one that they ever gave away. Fans could enter the drawing by pre-saving their new album, called The One, and one lucky winner was chosen to be the second ever owner of the dubstep duo's highly coveted jackets. On October 22nd, the album was released, and that same day, they dropped 4 new music videos. The first one is for their track called Flute Chillum, which is a collab with their longtime friend from Belgium, Apache. The music video for this one dives into similar themes as Shock Shell, as it's entirely focused on the energy of Mr. Wobble and Dark Wobble, without either of them making an appearance in the video. The second video is their collab with Boogie T called Up, which features an animation of Boogie T looking very reminiscent of Nigel Thornberry.
That was smashing!
The third video released that day was Mr. Fix It, a collab with Caspa, which shows Mr. Wobble wearing overalls and a tool belt, posing a threat to the entire Bob the Builder franchise. And the last video that was released that day was for the title track of the album, The One. 8 days after the album release, they went on their biggest tour ever, playing a total of 33 shows over the next month and a half. During the tour, they dropped one of their most iconic merch pieces, a Mr. Wobble plush, which have become fan favorites. To close out their massive year, they finished things off with a New Year's Eve countdown set at Snowda. At the beginning of 2020, they announced what would be one of their crowning achievements, Wobble Rocks at Red Rocks. Tickets quickly sold out, and they ended up getting 3 nights in a row booked at the venue, which is an insane feat that very few artists pull off. Unfortunately, once everything shut down due to COVID, they had to postpone the show for later in the year, but then even that had to be postponed again. I can't imagine how crushing that was. Plus, they had just recently moved to their new home of Los Angeles and couldn't even get out and enjoy the city. But regardless of the tough times, they found ways to engage with their community. In April, they released a Ganja White Night coloring book for free, but they gave fans the option to donate, and they matched every dollar that was donated, with the proceeds providing support for medical staff. A few weeks later, on 4/20, they released their only track of the year, a remix of Dear Weed Man by Boogie Trio. They also dropped a few new music videos that year, including Dark Heart Surgery, Girl Scout Cookies, Faraday VIP, and Double Dream, which is probably their trippiest video ever. Later on that summer, they dropped Ganja White Night Pride merch, with all of the profits donated to the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, an organization that protects and defends the human rights of Black transgender people. While still hoping for things to go back to normal, they still did have a lot of free time on their hands, so they were able to build out their first real studio, which I would imagine was a dream for them as producers. They did get to play a handful of shows that year, including 3 nights in a row in Chicago for a drive-in show, where they dropped a bunch of unreleased tracks, as well as 2 nights in San Bernardino, also for a drive-in show. Towards the end of the year, they released yet another music video, this time for Dirty Girl, where we see Dark Wobble brought back to life, which would set the stage for their new album. In 2021, Ganja White Night released their first track of the year in March, a collab with GRiZ called Ease Your Mind. They dropped a music video the same day that the song was released, and it's probably one of the most fun videos in the entire Wobbleverse. GRiZ's iconic bear branding, which hadn't been seen in many years, crashes his spaceship at the beginning of the video, but Mr. Wobble uses his Mr. Fix-It powers to save the day and transform it into an old-school lowrider. The GRiZ bear offers Mr. Wobble a gummy bear, and they go off on a trippy journey complete with dancing instruments that come to life. The next month, Ganja White Night released the lead single off of their upcoming album, complete with a music video, with the track called Trinity. The video gives us more insight into Dark Wobble's rise, and in the video, he becomes King Dark Wobble. Oh, and we also learned that Dark Wobble has a cute little green cat. A few weeks later on 4/20, they released their 9th album, called Dark Wobble, with Mr. Wobble's arch nemesis getting the spotlight this time. They had originally rescheduled their 3 nights at Red Rocks to be right before the album drop, but they had to push the shows back again, this time to November of 2021. Upon the release of the album, they had a new merch drop unveiling the new Dark Wobble plush. A few months later, on July 7th, they dropped the next music video in the Mr. Wobble saga, called Narnia. 1 month after that, they dropped the next video for the track Shipwreck. In this one, we see all sorts of animals who seem to harness Dark Wobble's green energy, including the return of Dark Wobble's cat, which, now that I think about it, kinda looks like the Pokemon known as Virizion. So I wonder if Evo or Ganja White Night are Pokemon fans, but it definitely could just be a coincidence since the shape of the cat's head is supposed to resemble Dark Wobble's face, which is also that triangle. So anyways, by the end of the video, Dark Wobble has enlisted a whole army of these green creatures. Meanwhile, the last time that we saw Mr. Wobble, he was tripping balls with GRiZ, so it's looking like Dark Wobble is gaining a significant competitive edge. However, fans would have to wait another year to see what happens next. By the summer of 2021, the live scene was beginning to return, and Ganja White Night had a run of festivals lined up like Bass Canyon, Imagine, Lost Lands, EDC Las Vegas, and more. In September, they released a collab with Slander called Miss You, and a few days later, they announced a 2-night New Year's Eve show in Detroit called Wobble NYE. The next month in October, they released Mr. Wobble and Dark Wobble onesies, which, just like the plushies, were a fan favorite. In November, their long-awaited 3 nights of Wobble Rocks finally became a reality after having to push back the shows for over a year and a half. At the end of the year, during their Wobble NYE show, they debuted a new track with LSDREAM, which was set to release the following year. In February of 2022, Bambi and his wife welcomed their second son into the world, so he understandably took a little bit of time away from the project. 2022 was a bit of a slower year for Ganja White Night, as they had already grown their reach considerably, so they were able to focus on having more of their own flagship shows while playing less gigs overall. Their first show of the year was in April, 2 nights of Ganja White Night Budz, this time in Chicago. Prior to the show, Ebo painted a mural in Chicago, just like he had in Minneapolis and Denver in previous years. 1 month after the show, they returned to EDC Las Vegas, followed by Escapade Music Festival. On June 1st, they finally released their collab with LSDREAM that they had debuted at Wobble NYE 6 months prior, complete with a music video. LSDREAM becomes part of the Wobbleverse in this video, being characterized by an alien with a mushroom cap, who we quickly learn is one of the most powerful beings in the entire Wobbleverse. Mr. Wobble finds the LSDREAM alien in the forest, destroying Dark Wobble's green spikes, and the alien teaches Mr. Wobble the way of his powers, which sets the stage for the next video in the series. They released another collab just 1 month later with Peekaboo, called Mitosis. 1 week after that, they played their first ever Wobble Coliseum with 2 nights at the famous Hampton Coliseum, featuring support from their recent collaborators LSDREAM and Peekaboo, as well as many others. Soon after, it was time for Ganja White Night Budz Denver Round 2, complete with a fresh new mural from Ebo. They then made a couple more festival appearances before their first ever 2-night Wobbleween event in Minneapolis took place. They closed out the final days of 2022 by playing Lights All Night in Dallas, followed by a New Year's Eve set at Decadence, Colorado. On January 20th of 2023, they released their first track of the year called Womp Portal, their second collab with Subtronics. The Womp Portal video is the next installment of the Wobbleverse series, where we get to see Mr. Wobble use the powers that he learned from LSDREAM. Mr. Wobble teams up with Subtronics and his Cyclops army to destroy Dark Wobble's lair, which is later revealed to be the place where Dark Wobble became King Dark Wobble in the Trinity music video. At the end of the video, Mr. Wobble and Subtronics say goodbye as Subtronics closes a portal in the sky, but Dark Wobble is floating behind the portal, implying that Mr. Wobble and Dark Wobble are about to face off. 3 months after the release of that video, they released their 10th and most recent album called Unity, with the album artwork featuring the hands of many of the characters that we have previously seen in the Wobbleverse. Upon the release of the album, they released a 13-minute video called Ganja White Night's Wobble World, which picks up where the Womp Portal video left off. Mr. Wobble and Dark Wobble fly towards each other, both landing punches to the other's face, when suddenly everything freezes and narration begins. The video then delves into the backstory of each character, ultimately tying all of the videos in the Wobbleverse saga together. It's honestly pretty mind-blowing, and like I said earlier in the video, I highly recommend watching all of the videos in order because there really is a lot of depth to the story that's being told. The very next day after that video was released, they released 7 more music videos and visualizers for Rolo, Kill the Feel with Infected Mushroom, Dark Light with Truth, Clarity with Boogie T, Redemption with RO, Infinity with Closey, and Bulldozer with Mr. Bill. 2 weeks after the album release, they held their second ever Wobble Rocks at Red Rocks, this time for 2 nights.
Holy shit. I don't think we'll ever get tired of this fucking amazing view.
Later in July, they hosted their second ever Wobble Coliseum for 2 nights just like the previous year. They also played at a wide variety of festivals in 2023, including Summer Camp, Forbidden Kingdom, Oceaga, Lost Lands, and they even got to headline Electric Forest for the first time ever. In October, they played a set at the Brooklyn Mirage, followed by the second installment of Wobbleween in Minneapolis to close out the month, ultimately ending the year with another return to Decadence, Colorado. To kick off 2024, they announced Wobble Rocks 3, where they would be playing both opening and closing sets, which is a great strategy to help your openers gain exposure. 1 month later, they announced that they would be playing their first ever set at Mission Ballroom the night before Wobble Rocks 3. During their Wobble Rocks show, they debuted a new collaboration with Tape B, which I imagine will probably get released sometime within the next year, maybe even later this year. Don't quote me on that though.
Yes, Ganja.
Recently, on June 21st, they released their most recent track called Hunters, and aside from that, they have plenty of festival appearances scheduled for the rest of the year, plus the return of Wobble Coliseum and Wobbleween. At this point in their career, Ganja White Night are among an elite club of premier bass music acts, but it's wild to think that they came close to never even making that happen. If they didn't have that tiny little bit of perseverance and optimism left around 2015 to 2016, Ganja White Night would have been history, having never made it anywhere close to where they are today. Their road to success was incredibly long, as it took them nearly 15 years to make it, and I think there are quite a few lessons that we can learn from that. It shows how powerful love can be when it's the centric driving force of your pursuits, rather than ever fluctuating external incentives. Their love for the music is the whole reason that Ganja White Night was formed in the first place, and it's the core reason why they were able to persevere when the future was full of so much uncertainty. Additionally, it shows us that you never really fail until you give up, and as long as your heart is still beating, you have a reason to keep going.
Yeah, if you quit, you just erase all your chances of success. That's for sure. That's the first thing. But if you don't quit, well, every day you run the dice, and sometimes you have a good one that leads you to a good road.